I was at Sisterwrite for its first 3 years, and I can't answer for the whole 15 years of its life. I was just one of the 3 founder members. And after leaving Sisterwrite, I moved away from London for some years, so I didn't play any part in its subsequent development. But it all began for me in the summer of 1978 when Mary Coghill and Kay Sterling came to see me at Compendium Books. And they said they wanted to start a women's bookshop and did I want to join them. Well, I didn't know Mary, but I did know Kay a little. But I was sceptical because I thought we needed, I had had thought for a bookshop before but never had any capital, and I thought we would need some serious money in order to get premises and stock and everything. But Mary had managed to save a bit. She had 5,000 and borrowed another 3 from one of her sisters. And we were clear at the beginning, she wanted to make it a donation, but we were clear at the beginning it would be a loan, and that when the shop got up and running, we would pay it back. And we did that. We thought we needed about 16,000 as a minimum. And we sent a letter of support around to lots and lots of different organisations and to individual women to sign and to say, you know, that they had confidence in what we wanted to do and that they were supporting our venture. So we got a lot of support that way. We got a few donations. I think you gave us a little one. And some low-interest loans. And we reached about 11,000. I don't think we ever made the 16, but we somehow managed on the 11. But it wasn't much money, and we, of course, worked without wages for quite some time. They wanted my involvement because I was managing the women's section at Compendium. Well, actually, they called it sexual politics. Interesting. And for those of you who don't know of it, Compendium was the biggest and the best of the alternative bookshops, the radical bookshops in London then. It was on Camden High Street, and at its height, I think it had 3 different shops. It was a great centre for alternative culture, and I have to say that at times I did clash with it. There was more than a little pornography around, and things came to a head with some really offensive postcards, and I went through the shop ripping them off the doors and had a big fight with the person who put them up. But it was that kind of place. It was sort of libertarian, if not to say libertine. But I think it very much reflected the culture of its time. But I was allowed full say over my section. I paid myself from the till, ordered what I thought was right, and it was the only interview for a job I ever went to where they asked me my star sign. And luckily, Virgos were okay. I had worked, they did all kinds of mad things, they were mad buggers. I had worked at Houseman's, the Peace News bookshop, as it was known then in King's Cross, and of course that's still there today. We've just passed it on our way here, looking about as tatty as it did then, really. And I managed all the radical periodicals for them down in the basement. Anyway, the point of this being that I had some specialist knowledge, and I was a book-selling professional, and to some extent publishing. I'd done a bit in publishing as well. And Kay had also worked in books. She'd been at Collett's, the bookshop in the centre of London. And from the beginning, we wanted to be really good booksellers. I think that's quite important. We knew that in order for the shop to work, we had to do it really well. You know, it had to make a profit to survive. So I agreed to give it a try. I thought it was very exciting. It was the idea of being able to do something ourselves that would fully reflect our politics. It would be under our control. We could do things our way, and we could show that women could do it. It was just irresistible, really. And perhaps it's worth reminding ourselves at this point that women were having to learn all sorts of new skills in order to live more autonomous lives and to do our politics. And just to prove that we could do it, whatever it was. Women weren't thought capable of hardly anything. Autonomy was the big word then, whether it was about our movement or on a more personal level. Only women, the original women's press, had to go out and learn how to print in order to get control of the whole process, in order to be able to publish what they wanted to publish and when and how. So we fitted closely into the existing radical and political alternative culture. And I'm going to mention Publications Distribution Co-op here. There's Pam and Alison and Gail Chester worked there, and all the networks for support that began to be formed. And I think we were all both a product of and an enabler of the huge amount of radical writing that was taking place then. Without all the networks, little point in writing, and without the writers, little point in the network. So it was a kind of virtuous circle, if you like. And I think that's a really important thing. It's very much about context, this talk. And I think without that around us, it would have been very difficult to make a success of the shop. Kay and I both lived in squats, and that was a way of getting control of our housing, so that instead of living in little isolated bedsits, we could live collectively, or at least try and live collectively. And I was living in the London Field squats then, where we opened a number of women's houses, and which eventually led to a women's housing co-op. I think Leah's still there. Where are you, darling? Yes, she's still there. Anyway, the main thing about living in the squat then was that there was no rent, and that made it possible for us to live on the dole until the shop was beginning to make enough money to pay wages. So again, we couldn't have done it without being able to live in a very cheap place. It all fits together. We worked part-time on the project from June to September, and then full-time, taking possession of the shop in November and opening early in December. Sorry? 78. 78. We decided on a structure that was essentially a workers' co-op. We did have a few other women who were technically members of the co-op, since I think you had to have 7 to be legitimate at the time, and we were only 3. But it was always in the hands of its workers, and we replaced them with workers as the numbers of us grew. We were always clear that it was a workers' cooperative. And that was another thing. Cooperatives are non-profit making, in that profits go back into the business, or the given away, or whatever, but you do not, as individuals, privately own the business and its profits. So it was very much non-profit making in that sense, and that was very much part of our politics. We chose very deliberately to set it up that way. There was also a saying then that co-ops were self-managed exploitation, since so many paid rubbish wages and they expected staff to give their all, and I'm sure other people have lots of stories along those lines. But we decided to try and give ourselves good conditions of work, even if we couldn't pay a great deal. So, for example, we had a 4-day week, 6 weeks holiday, and we allowed provision for a worker to take a year off if she wanted, thinking being that, well, if you could have a year off to have a baby, why not have a year off to do something else? Go to college or write a book or whatever it was, do some travelling, do some training. We thought that was an important principle. And we were very much a collective. We were having meetings and taking decisions together. We consciously operated on consensus. And there may have been 1 or 2 differences of opinion, but by and large we really got on well together. We respected one another, and we respected the fact that we were a bit different. We didn't have all the same interests. And, for example, Kay was very interested in non-sexist children's literature, and she did a lot of work over the years to develop that. Mary was in the Matriarchy Study Group, and incidentally, the very first group that I ever recall being split by a transsexual. So, just to remind you that it actually started quite a long time ago. And all I remember for about 2 years was endless. They had endless problems trying to resolve that problem. And it was transsexual then rather than transgender. But the 3 of us were all radical feminists, and we thought that was really significant. That in order to do the project successfully, we had a strong basis for agreement in our politics, in our ways of working, in our values.
What did you say about the transsexual person? I didn't hear that
I said that the Matriarchy Study Group, which Mary was a member of, was the very first group that I had ever heard of who were split over whether a transsexual should be a member or not. Okay? I'm just raising that because it's so very relevant now, that's all. But, just to point out that it was happening then. So we set the shop up with a lot of help from friends, and some of you are here. I know some of you helped, and I do remember Sandy's Wood now. And Penny Collier came and helped build bookshops, I think, and bookshelves, and Chris, of course. And lots of other people came along. Lee with the electrics. I can't remember everybody now, I'm sorry, but, if you want to add in what you did, please do. And Jo Nesbitt, the cartoonist, came, and she helped. And she was later responsible for the wonderful nun whales that could be seen swimming around the water. Sisterwrite. Now, I'm going to start passing these things around. There is a postcard of the nun whales in here, which you might enjoy. There's also our catalogue, and there's some photographs that some of you will remember from the very, very early days. So I'll pass these around, just take a look. And at the end, there's a whole load of photographs that Pam has brought for me today, and I haven't had time to label those or anything, but they're lovely photographs.
It was just the opening of Sisterwrite.
It was just the opening of Sisterwrite. Okay, well that's lovely, and there's lots of old friends in there. So if you want to pass those round, people can take a look at that. We had identified the premises on Upper Street, I think in the summer of '78, and a friend of Mary's had some spare money, and this was a man, and I think it was Mr. Wolfe, I'm not entirely certain. But he bought it, and we rented it from him. He was not otherwise involved in the collective, and it was always our bottom line that this would be a women-only venture. We couldn't make the shop women-only, and I've read stuff on the internet that said that we were, but we weren't, and we couldn't have been because it was illegal at the time. Later on, Sisterwrite was, but we had to fend people off from going upstairs. But anyway, but there was a need in general to deal with men, distributors, libraries, academics, suppliers, all kinds of things. So we were never separatist in that absolute sense. Well, or in a sense, actually. I do remember one man leaving the shop with a friend at one time, and he, as he was going out, he said, isn't it a pity that they leave out half the human race? And I just, isn't it a pity that they leave out half the human race? Said this man. And I just thought, oh God, the irony, you know. And we did have some trouble with men occasionally. Kay was threatened once by a very aggressive bloke in the shop. We had graffiti sprayed on the windows, and once our locks were glued up. We did have a wire grill installed at the front of the building, shatterproof glass, and a buzzer inside to alert women upstairs. And I think it's really important to remember what the atmosphere was like then, because it's so different now. And one or two bookshops had actually been bombed. The politics of the time were extremely volatile. And we didn't see the police as our friend either. We had the odd one in plain clothes come in, very obviously listening to our conversations and phone calls and noting down titles. And we thought our phone was probably tapped. We once picked up the phone to find the National Abortion Campaign on the other end of the phone, and they hadn't phoned us, and we hadn't phoned them. And we did a little test, the time I told you how to test your phone. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
And it did indicate that our phone was tapped. So I had forgotten all of that, but, you know, we obviously were quite concerned about it at the time. And there were links between radicals and, you know, for example, with the Baader-Meinhof group, and one of their one of their women had been living in the squats in the East End as well. So, you know, they weren't entirely without foundation, some of these suspicions. But having said all of that, it was a bookshop for women, and most importantly, it was really a centre for the women's liberation movement. We were all very active in the movement and clear about that. I'd been involved with Only Women, and at one time I'd been on the coven at Earlham Street, where I'd met my first radical feminists in the shape of Lillian Mohin of Only Women fame, and Sheila Shulman, who's sadly not with us anymore. So I was very much part of that wing of the movement. Kay was involved with the Women's Arts Alliance and with literature, and Mary had a passion for history and healing, but we were all clear that we were radical feminists. We were fine about coming from different places, and we trusted each other's feminisms and our integrity as individuals. They were, and as far as I know, are extremely fine women. It's a great pleasure to work with them. So we had to work really hard getting the rundown shop into some order, and it was really run down, very dirty, and Upper Street was not the trendy place it is now. Just down the road from us, some of you will remember this, there was an old-fashioned underwear shop, and you know, the kind with yellow cellophane in the windows to stop the sun spoiling the suspender belts and the capacious bras on display. And they went on pricing in handwritten pounds, shilling and pence labels until the day they finally went down. And the King's Head pub down the road was very popular and busy as a theatre pub, and it kept its huge silver till and continued with pounds, shillings and pence too for many years. And for all I know, it maybe even still does. It was the kind of street that time forgot, basically. And we weren't as close to a tube as we'd have liked. We were in between Highbury Corner and the Angel, but it was the best we could do, and we just hoped that women would come and find us, and they did. You did. But I'm jumping the gun a bit. One of the most important things we knew we had to do was to find some way of getting books from the USA. Quite a lot of the stuff that I had sold at Compendium was from the States. So many things were being published there, and so little in Britain, that we knew it would be vital to our success. I'd already taken home, does anybody remember card index files? Yeah. I'd taken my Compendium one home, and we'd laboriously sat out there and copied it out. We probably shouldn't have done that, but we did. So we had the basis of a database. And then I went to the States. We could only send one person, we could only afford one person to go, and they agreed it would be me. And I went to Woman Books in New York, and I asked them if I could go through their whole stock and make notes. And they said yes. They were just great, really. They were very sisterly. They were the biggest and the best of the women's bookshops there, I think. And they were a private concern, so not necessarily, they were owned by the women who worked there. But they were very sisterly. They said yes, and they had a huge collection of books. So I just spent days standing on stools and ladders and taking books down and writing out cards. And I can't really think how I did it all then, but I did.
All those ISBN numbers?
Not the ISBN numbers, but the publishers and the distributors. You're asking too much. It takes a professional, doesn't it, really? But, we have to remember how laborious all this information stuff was then. It isn't like it is now. And I also went and I saw distribution organisations, and I set up accounts so we could order directly from them. I set up an account with an American bank so that we could pay our American suppliers in dollar checks and avoid a lot of the costs of that. I went to San Francisco to see some of the small publishers and set up more accounts. Sorry? Yeah, it was terrible. And I went to Philadelphia too, and I can't for the life of me remember why, but I went there too. Anyway, the upshot was that we were then able to provide a very comprehensive selection of books for our customers, not just the mainstream presses, but the pamphlets, the small press stuff, the political journals and papers such as Offobacks and Sinister Wisdom. And I have put down over there a selection. They're all a bit grubby and old now, but some of the stuff that we used to sell in the shop. So there's all kinds of periodicals and newsletters just for people to have a quick look at. And perhaps I should mention here that we didn't always get what we ordered. If customs didn't like a book in your consignment, then they could, and they did, confiscate the whole box. And it was very difficult to get it back again. So somehow loads of porn got in, but if they didn't fancy the joy of lesbian sex, for example, then they could just confiscate it. The same thing happened in Spare Rib going to Ireland, and I think there were quite a few issues of Spare Rib that never made it to Ireland. And again, hard to remember these things now because things are so different, really.
Goes the word kept losing stock in the same way.
Did they? I'm sure they would have done. Oh. Yes, absolutely. And, they were quite high-handed about it. It was very difficult to get anything back from them, and it cost a lot of money. But let's not forget some of our other imports, and Olivia Records in particular, the women's music company. If you've never heard Meg Christian's Gym Teacher, you've really missed out. Make a point of it. I don't know if it's on YouTube these days. Does anybody know? Is it on YouTube these days? It'd be interesting. It's bloody marvellous and it's really funny. And I mean, it did get a bit tedious. Everywhere, every lesbian house you went to was playing the same records again and again. And what was the Waterfall one? Chris Williamson, the bloody waterfall one.
Yeah.
I remember going to a concert of hers, and she did so many of those kinds of songs that women in the audience started shouting out. This is in Manchester, saying, "What about women? Never mind bloody water." Anyway, I think I heard that these days Olivia Records do very successful cruises for lesbians. So they hire huge boats full of lesbians. That's a very extraordinary concept, really. Imagine that. It was a matter of personal pride to me, and to all of us, I think, that we should have everything, or at least know of it, and where to get it. And it wasn't a question of profitability. We didn't only stock things that sold, as I know many bookshops did and still do. And, you know, they would have, if something hadn't sold within 6 weeks, they'd get rid of it or something. But we didn't do that because we were trying to operate as a centre for knowledge and activity for the women's movement, the WLM. We were a physical location where you could go, meet other women. My anarcho-feminist group at the time often met at Sisterwrite, and I think there's a couple of photos of Pam's photos of them in there. You could find newsletters that would tell you what was happening, read notices for groups or somewhere to live, find the latest book or article, the one everybody was discussing at the time, or find something really obscure, books on medieval women or women in Victorian literature, lesbian books and newsletters, and some of which were kept under the counter. One of which was down there, The Guide to Self-Exam, from Only Women by our lovely Sophie Lord. And I have another prop. This. Does anybody know what this is? This is a speculum, and it was sold with the pamphlet so that you could get there and do it yourself. And I should say there's some beautiful pictures of my cervix in there. But I didn't let Sophie bring it today because it was all a bit too embarrassing. Oh, what else was under the counter? But that really was a terrible photo shoot. I'll never forget that. We had Betty Dodson's Liberating Masturbation. That was very popular indeed. We sold many copies of that. And I think the art of the female orgasm was something we definitely had to teach ourselves and each other. Yeah, definitely. We sold badges, and we sold lovely women's symbol in silver. Paddy Tanton made a lot of those, and little labyrinth axes and all kinds of badges. I had hoped to bring a few today, but I've mislaid them. So, have you got some? How lovely. Anyway, A Woman's Place was operating at the time in central London, and they sold a few books too, as well as being primarily an information centre. We were very anxious not to upset them or to damage them in any way. So we went to see them very early on, and later, when we were up and running and we had some money, we gave them some. And I think in our first year we were able to give them and Wires, the national newsletter, £500 each. And I think we bailed Wires out again when they had no money for printing. So we were very clear that we wanted to try and do that. It was always our intention to pass money on to other feminist organisations when we could. And we spent ages thinking about, well, how could we do that and who should be prioritised? It was all very difficult. But we certainly did some of it. I don't know how long that went on, because I don't know how long the shop was profitable, really. And we did start to pay ourselves as soon as we could, having opened a couple of months before Christmas. Well, actually, do you know what? I think it was the 1st of December. Do you remember, Alison? Was it? Was it? So I suspect we had a celebration the next year on the 1st of December. So I think it may have been the 1st of December. And the word was really spreading by then. We're getting loads of women coming to the shop. And I remember the first time, it was just around Christmas, when we took £1,000 in one day, and it just seemed a huge amount, and it was such a relief, and it was kind of, well, maybe it is going to work. And of course, our American books in particular were expensive, and I do remember being verbally duffed up at the disco because we weren't selling books cheap to women, and got a lot of harassment for that. But we couldn't do that. As I said at the beginning, we knew we had to make some kind of profit to survive, but it was never a private profit or a capitalist venture. Few of us then, you'll remember this, had a problem expressing whatever it was we thought about whatever anybody else was doing in the name of feminism. So you had to be prepared to be challenged, however good you thought your motives were. And of course, selling politics, as in a sense we were, was just asking for it. However, all the informal services we offered, we did so for free. Women would telephone to ask for all kinds of information, when the next demo was, how they could contact someone, where they could get an abortion even. And remembering what I said earlier about the phone being tapped, we could have gotten in very deep water had we passed on information about illegal abortion networks, of which there were some. So we were always very careful. We did those things for the love of feminism, to promote and spread the word, to be a service to women, well, and to lesbians, of course. And then there was little in the way of facilities and services. The local councils were having great battles to set up lesbian and gay units. That was a little bit later, but I think it had already started then. And there wasn't very much in the way of literature, but we tried to have everything that there was, even if some of the novels were more than a bit naff, and I'm sure you remember some of those. We won't go there. And as I said, we kept things under the counter that were in any way sensitive. Women's newsletters meant only for women, catcall and wires, they're all on the table, or only for lesbians. It was important to open up those networks for communication. And there wasn't an internet, of course, and that's exactly why books, periodicals, journals, pamphlets were so important. Conference papers, discussion articles and newsletters, all these things were in the print medium, and we made our own. In the very early days, we got access to bander machines, which were really filthy things with big drums of ink in the middle, and later on we used gestetners and cut wax stencils, so they were a little easier. But it was no mean feat, all of that, really. But it was only by controlling those means of production and distribution that we got the power to decide what was printed and where it went. So spreading the word about a demonstration, for example, it took time, from advertising in newsletters or journals to posters, and Sisterwrite kept many posters for sale as well as for information. I think they became a feminist art form, and I'm sure some of you have got some of those. And of course, word of mouth. Meetings were important, and we did things face to face. When a number of women wanted to discuss entering the Labour Party as a strategy, that sounds familiar. Surprise, surprise. We agreed to have the meeting at the shop to discuss the pros and cons. So relevant again now. But so many women came then that we had to close the shop doors, and I was worried about the wooden floors on the first floor where the meeting would take place. I thought it would collapse, and we had no right to hold big meetings like that in the shop, no permission to do that kind of thing. And there were still women in the street banging on the doors, insisting on coming in. That's how important it was. And, it was a very, very heated discussion. And, of course, there was no agreement. But some women went away and did that, and some women who'd argued that we needed to have a strong and autonomous, independent women's movement to keep pressure on the parties went on doing that. And I think, both things were useful. They, worked in different ways. And I think, people made gains for women in both those environments. No, I won't go to that now. Anyway, my point being that we did things together, we argued them out, we disagreed profoundly, and we were sometimes really nasty, and sometimes funny, and often weepy with the passion of it. But we did it in real reality and not virtual reality, and that, I think, is why we changed things and ourselves so profoundly and formed bonds that have connected us all of our lives and kept us engaged all of our lives. And I wanted to say that. I won't bang on about it, but it just seems important to me that so much political activity is taking place online now and in a very different way, and that we just don't forget the importance of being there with each other. And that was what Sisterwrite was for ultimately, so that if you went looking for the women's liberation movement, as I had a few years before, you would find it. Sisterwrite was opened during the next year, 1979, as a cafe where women could come and relax, and as I said, that was women only. Caroline Forbes, another good woman that we've lost, opened it up and it became very popular. She was joined later by Frankie Green, now of the Women's Liberation Music Archive fame, and Judith Skinner. And Caroline had spent time, there's some lovely pictures of Caroline in there, by the way. She'd spent time in Australia, and she was a great fan of jaffles. I think there's a menu in there as well. I don't know if anybody remembers those. They were basically toasted sandwiches in a special machine, everything from eggs to jam. And they were tremendous, or at least Caroline thought they were tremendously popular. So we went on having jaffles for quite a long time. And the lovely, lovely Liz Trott, who also died a few years back now. She was a great gardener, and she worked the little garden out the back. It didn't even belong to us, but we made it a lovely place to sit and be and have a chat. And so, you know, the shop grew in that way. In that sense, we were the forerunner, I think, of the destination bookshop, where you had a coffee shop and you became somewhere to spend time and not just buy something. And all the big chains went in for that in a big way later on. And we also gave space upstairs to the WRRC, the Women's Research and Resources Centre, and we gave them periodicals from the shop and provided a reading room that any woman could use. So if you wanted to read something, you didn't have to buy it in the shop, you could go out there and read it. So that was also a very useful archive. Many women used and valued that. And I do recall one day that Bea Campbell was researching her latest book up there. And we went out and closed the shop downstairs, locked it all up. I didn't realise that we'd left all these women locked, including Bea. So I gather they did manage to get out eventually via a back alley. And although I swear I didn't do it deliberately, yeah, I didn't. It did make me smile. As there was a lot of hostility between sock femmes and rad femmes at the time. And I've never forgotten or forgiven something I heard once at a lesbian left show, I think it was, which said, "You could sleep with a radical feminist, but don't on any account talk to them." That's about right. And I don't remember doing this, but apparently we stickered books we didn't agree with, including Bea's Sweet Freedom. I'm sure we were quite opinionated enough to do that, and incidentally, I really value a lot of what Bea does now, but, you know, this was quite a long time ago. Certainly we stickered books that had a sexist cover that we didn't approve of, and, for example, Susie Orbach's Fat as a Feminist Issue being one that I think we all got successfully changed. Authors didn't necessarily get control of their covers then, but they started to write it into their contracts because they realised, particularly feminist authors, otherwise they'd be saddled with something horrendous just to sell copies. We had readings. March Piercy was one, and we organised that at the King's Head down the road, but I know there were other visiting poets and writers too. We didn't do book signings, as we thought it was a bit star-worshipping. So we were a bit holier than thou at times. But it was so very much frowned upon in the movement to be famous or to stick your head above the parapet, and we were determined not to have leaders. I think it was very difficult for those women who were trying to do things publicly, and all they got was criticism for it, but let's not go there again either. The shop did become a centre that was known internationally. There were some links with European feminists, as well as all the obvious ones with America, and we stocked some literature from Denmark and France. And Sisterwrite was contacted by the French feminists who were challenging a group in France who had tried to take out legal rights over the words women's liberation movement.
C.K. Poe.
Yes.
C.K. Poe, yes.
Yes, that's the one.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Well, I'd forgotten all of
Yes.
that. And so they tried, yes, to take the legal right out, completely split their movement. I mean, they had huge fights over it.
Terrible.
It was a terrible thing to do. And, of course, we were appalled about that, but I don't know if we could or did anything to practically support them. But it was interesting that that was actually something that was brought up, that we had been asked about and that we took a view on. We produced a catalogue of books and everything that we stocked so that women who lived outside London could have access to. And that also went abroad, and we had a number of women in different countries ordering things from us. We got a grant of £2,600 from the Equal Opportunities Commission to do the first one. The one you've got there is the second one, much larger than the first one. I don't remember any other grants that we got because we did basically work successfully as a commercial enterprise. The Equal Opportunities Commission sent a male photographer to take pictures of us for their publications. But I sent him away, suggesting politely that they send a woman photographer instead. He went back and told them he'd been savaged by a little old lady. I'll admit I might have had a grey hair or two, but I think you can see from the photos it wasn't entirely accurate description. I'll admit to it now, though, and I think I'm much more savage. But the catalogue was, I think, very useful. It contained comments and descriptions, as well as ordering information and lists of useful groups and organisations. Again, it was a hell of a lot of work, but worth it to disseminate the material and to include women who, for whatever reason, couldn't get to the shop. We tried to make sure we reflected the important debates at the time and the widest range of women's issues. We kept sections on what we described then as Black, Asian and Third World women's writing, and women's liberation politics, including class and disability, and violence against women, and lesbian literature and politics. We were not a very diverse collective ourselves at the beginning, but I believe that changed somewhat over the years. And sometimes we stocked material that we didn't necessarily agree with. We had some stuff on the S&M debate just because we thought the debate was really important. And often books that weren't by feminists or didn't take a feminist line, if it was something about women we thought very useful or unique in some way. And feminists visiting London came to the shop from all over the world. One of my personal favourite moments was being able to introduce two women who had been expelled from the Soviet Union for their feminist activities to the then editor of Manushi, the Indian feminist magazine. And that just felt like a moment, you know. One of the Russian feminists was trying to survive by selling her watercolours, and I've put a couple in the file there too, and we stocked and sold them for her. One of my least favourite moments occurred when I was standing by the feminist fiction, science fiction section. I liked science fiction, and I thought I was a bit of an expert by then. And I was asked by a customer what I thought of Marion Zimmer Bradley's books, and I replied somewhat sniffly that they were okay if you liked fairy tales with dragons in them. Of course, when she came to the counter, it turned out she was Marion Zimmer Bradley. God, I could still blush over that. But she seemed to take it good. It was a mean thing to do to me, actually. And it wasn't the only terrible thing I did there, but you'll have to get me drunk to get the rest out. We took books to conferences and we ran bookstalls there, often donating part of the proceeds. And we supplied a lot of books on sale or return to women who wanted to sell them at their various events. And again, not really profitable, but essential in doing the work we were trying to do. We stocked libraries. Where is she? There she is. Partly thanks to you. One or two of them would just send us some money, saying that they were trying to set up a women's section, and could we choose and send them a selection of books, and we did that. And then women who worked in academia often made a point of ordering through us. And it's good to remember that debates such as those in Love Your Enemy and Breaching the Peace, the only women pamphlets, were included in women's studies then. We attended conferences in Manchester, Leeds, Amsterdam. There were links with other feminists in bookshops, Jane at Grassroots, Mandy at News from Nowhere in Liverpool. They came and visited us, and we had a conference, I think at the end of '79, of feminists in bookselling and distribution. Anybody remember that? PBC women over there? Yeah. And we had very little shoplifting to contend with. Not quite none, but it wasn't the problem it had been for many other shops, I think. We did have a small group of boys that caused a bit of trouble, and they ran into the shop with toy guns and stole a donation box, I think, at one point. But by the time I left, which is after 3 years, the shop was very successful. We'd taken on Jane Tilley, another one, sadly isn't here anymore, to work in the shop. We were able to pay ourselves a reasonable amount by then. The shop had taken enough to get a mortgage on the premises, and it was stable and well established. And of course, we'd learned all the necessary skills, how to pay wages, run accounts, do stock taking, deal with suppliers from here and abroad. Whatever we needed, we learned. We'd become well known as a bookshop and centre, and I think we did it well in terms of knowing our stuff and knowing who our customers, supporters, audience were and what they wanted. I did read around that time a fashion piece in, I think it was the Evening Standard of all things, where they were remarking on the return of skirts. The return of skirts. And they actually said that even one or two members of the Sisterwrite collective had been seen wearing them. And the implication being that if even the dykes at Sisterwrite were wearing skirts, they must be cool again. So we even became fashion icons too. Hard to imagine when I think back on the old shirts and dungarees and silver-sprayed monkey boots and schoolboy ties and blazers at discos. And I'm thinking that's a whole other topic for the Lesbian History Group. What did lesbians wear? I think it's a very interesting topic. Yeah. And maybe some wonderful photographs to show us. It was, of course, assumed that we were all lesbians, which was never quite true. But the shop was also part of lesbian culture at the time. Women could and did meet in the shop, eyes meeting over a volume of Sappho, and go for a coffee upstairs. I got chatted up a couple of times. I'm coming clean on this. And at one time, a young customer was waiting for me outside the shop when we closed up. I was very surprised. I didn't think I'd agreed to anything. We just had a chat at the till. But apparently, I'd accepted a piece of chewing gum. And it was somehow lost on me. I had no idea that was somehow significant for I'm willing to spend the night with you. But there you go. And we did have a rule that collective members weren't to sleep with each other. It didn't last long. And if my memory serves me right, you can blame Caroline and I for that one. But much of the culture surrounding the shop at the time was lesbian. The squats some of us were living in were a way of living the way we wanted as lesbians, with all our experiments with monogamy and non-monogamy and group living.
Can I just interrupt you to say that we did have a session on lesbians and squatting?
Oh, did you?
Yeah,
okay.
By Chris Wall over here.
Oh, you've already done it?
Yes.
Oh, sorry. Well,
Yes.
I was just going to give a couple of little stories.
Yeah. Well, okay, no, give the stories.
They are slightly Sisterwrite connected, you see.
Yeah.
In our squat, Penny put a bath in the middle of the hall, so you could well come in and find a woman in the bath in the hall. Not only the women who lived in the house. And I once knocked on the door of another woman's house to have it opened by Rosie, who was fully naked. It was a very hot day. And Rosie was the one who did the beautiful piece of stained glass that was in the window. I don't know where that went. Anybody know where that went? No? Well, that was a rather lovely piece, and it graced our front windows for some time. But there's just something about women being strong and autonomous that turns women into lesbians. And to make the squats habitable, some of us had to learn how to do the electrics, thanks to Lee, but this is also relevant again. She turned our meter back, so really they owed us money rather than us owing them. And that was another way we could afford to set up the shop, because we really weren't having to pay bills very much. And the redoubtable Chris taught me how to put a sash window in. Hi, Chris. And I must say I treasure the memory, although I have never done it again. I guess that what I'm trying to say is that we were creating an alternative society where women did things for themselves, and somehow that seems a very lesbian thing to do. And we also supported one another as a collective, though we didn't necessarily socialise or talk about what was happening in our personal lives a lot. When I was not at my best, heartbroken and distinctly flaky, Kay and Mary took the strain, and when Mary was ill, similarly we did, or when Kay arrived at work in tears, we put that first, and we tried to see each other through, whatever it was. And Islington, unfashionable as it was at the time, was also the home of the famous Crown and Woolpack Women's Disco and others later on. Happy memories. I think some of the women's events combining music, poetry and mad dressing up and all kinds of things were also held at Islington and Finsbury town halls. Anybody remember that?
Yeah.
I think they were.
We all remember.
You do, good. So, you know, lots of lesbians in the area basically by then. So I think the existence of the shop and publishers and also encouraged many women to write. And there were lots of writing groups at the time too, be it novels or articles, having a place where they will be published and distributed and sold and have a readership is essential, and particularly important for lesbians at the time who really didn't have access to mainstream publishing and bookselling, or indeed access much to each other. But I'm sure much more will be said at the Only Women Talk that you're having in December. Novels were as important as political writings, and we sold books such as The Women's Room by Marilyn French almost by the hundred. Dale Spender's book on language, I think it was called Man-Made Language, was another important one, and I think the first to really bring home the importance of the words that we use and who gets to define those and how much they shape our thinking. And I've been thinking a lot about that again because I think it's important all over again, particularly in terms of the current trans debate, but also hugely significant in thinking about race, class, disability, animal rights, all forms of oppression. We imported Mary Daly's works, and gynecology was such an important text that the Women's Press decided to publish it here, and they asked us to stop selling the US version, and we did. I like to think that there was a general sense of supporting each other's projects and a willingness to cooperate. And much to my amazement at the time, the Sunday Times reprinted straight pages from gynecology right across the front of one of their front pages on one of their supplements. It was an extraordinary thing to do, and I can't imagine now that happened, but it did happen. And they described it as, what's the opposite of nadir? Zenith. All right, well, they described it as the zenith of radical feminism. And, you know, extraordinary that they did that, really. Hard to imagine now. It's significant also, I think, that many of us knew each other, that it was a social circle too, that some of us lived together and learned from each other and wrote for each other and fought each other and loved each other. We gave one another strength and formed a living, vibrant, energetic community, and we did have an amazing time. Sisterwrite could never have existed without all the women who helped and all the women who came and bought books and passed the word, and all the women who wrote and printed and drove things round in vans. We were all part of the wider feminist network that linked in not just to publishing and bookselling, but much further out to colleges, schools, universities. There were loads of feminists involved in all those places. It was a collective manifestation in the broadest and best sense. And I just want to quote here the end of the collective statement in the second Sisterwrite catalogue. We owe our existence to the women's liberation movement and the continuing strength and creativity of feminism. So we knew that all along. And I suppose I need to say just a little bit about the end. The shop lasted for 15 years, but things had changed a great deal over that time. My last experiences of the shop had been of a rundown place with little energy or enthusiasm. But to be fair, there wasn't the same women's movement to support it anymore. And everyone was selling feminist books, and many other things had changed. The big chains had been able to dominate the trade once compulsory retail prices, the RRP, ended, and they could discount books, which they did massively. There was a campaign not to let them do that, but of course the government overruled us. So it meant the end for many small bookshops. But also the whole political climate had changed beyond recognition. Kay and I went to see the remaining collective members, not women that we knew, when we heard that the shop was to close. We wanted to know what had happened and what was going to happen to the money. We had thought originally in taking out the mortgage that whatever happened to Sisterwrite, that there would be a pot of money left from the sale of the premises, which could fund another women's project, and Islington had become a very desirable place to be by then. But we were told that they had remortgaged the property in order to keep going, and now it all belonged to the bank. So it was very disappointing for us. But as I said, the whole world had changed, and Thatcher's Britain was a very different kettle of fish. Overall, I don't think we ever thought Bookshop would have lasted that long. It did some wonderful things in its day. It provided employment for a lot of women over the years. It was a good example of a women's cooperative, a workers' cooperative, and I think it had an impact on many women's lives. We were part of, all of us who created this network, were part of something much bigger. When women began to have more confidence that our voices were worth being heard, that the networks of publishers, journals, distributors and booksellers meant that you could be heard. We depended on them and they on us. And it became a great flowering of creativity for women, from novelists to polemicists. Women's voices entered mainstream culture in a way that they really had not done before. We weren't going to be silenced anymore. Speaking was a political act for all of us. And I'm very proud to have been part of that and of the movement that was its inspiration and made so much possible.
Yeah.